My name is Heidi Messer, and I am chairman and co-founder of Collective I, the knowledge network that creates enterprise value out of business and marketing data. Prior to Collective I, co-founded and ran LinkShare until its sale to Rakuten in 2005 for $425 million. And I'm here to introduce today's topic, socializing big data. Big data is all about distilling massive amounts of information into insights with tremendous strategic value. So I'm going to practice what I preach and employ a Japanese presentation technique called Pecha Kucha. The idea is to convey your message in 20 slides lasting 20 seconds each. So for those of you who need help with math, I have 6 minutes to introduce the topic of big data and its enormous importance. So here goes. What is big data? Big data Big data is the term that describes a set of opportunities and issues that arise when the data sets generated doing business are so large that neither humans nor spreadsheets can process them. The interesting issues arise not on how to store the data, I'll leave that to the engineers, but rather how to realize its value as a strategic asset. So why should you care? Consider this. Somehow, despite the worst global economic downturn since the Great Depression, companies like Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook enjoy double and triple-digit growth. In a good economy, their performance would be remarkable. In this economy, it's miraculous. What are these companies doing right when all else is failing? I'm going to argue that the secret is in their use of data. These companies all have products, networks, and services, but what's distinctive is how central data is to all of their operations. For example, did you know that 35% of Amazon's sales are generated from the recommendation engine they created to analyze consumer preferences? Business is at an inflection point, and big data is about to profoundly change the way we all operate. To make my case, I'm going to draw on the historical example of Henry Ford and how he established the automotive industry. It's worth noting that Henry Ford did not even invent the automobile. Even in 1901, horseless carriages had been a plaything of the extremely wealthy for over 15 years. Ford recognized that his contemporaries had missed an opportunity. Cars need not be a luxury. The market could and should include the masses. I will build a motor car for the great multitudes, Ford proclaimed upon the birth of the Model T in 1908. To achieve his vision, Ford relied on a neglected asset, human labor. First, he streamlined the production of inexpensive cars with an efficient new labor process, the assembly line. Second, Ford did something that was unheard of. He more than doubled his workers' pay. His goal was to build less expensive cars and to create a larger market through his employees, who could now purchase the vehicles they produced. This philosophy, or paradigm shift, or whatever you want to call it, required thinking about human capital as an overlooked asset. Unlocking its value had stunning global implications. The car became the propeller of a new, more connected economy. It opened new markets, it changed where people lived, how they worked, and the goods and services they delivered. So you may be wondering what this story could possibly have to do with big data. Well, I believe that big data will be as revolutionary to business as the car was to modern life. How organizations use data collected in the course of doing business will reshape it. Every company will need a data strategy to ensure their future in the digital age. Today, companies use data to judge their business. Going forward, companies will use data to make markets. Viewing data as an asset class rather than a byproduct changes the game. Companies, and countries for that matter, that keep doing things the old way will experience the fate of the horse-drawn carriage and fall farther and farther behind. In the past, the strategic advantages of big data were a luxury for a select few. There were behemoths like Walmart and Tesco who could afford the expensive systems that analyzed data and turned it into an advantage. Today, it's the internet giants like Google and Facebook whose entire businesses are built around the strategic use of data. But the internet is the great equalizer. It has enabled all companies to collect hordes of data from both traditional and new sources, like Facebook, SurveyMonkey, and Twitter. The challenge is turning data into something valuable and to solve for organizational silos, limited access to data, and the time-consuming process of compiling data from numerous sources. Until recently, the cost of simply making sense of data outweighed the benefits. What's changed is the emergence of what we're calling knowledge networks, platforms like Collective Eye that enable any organization to analyze and socialize data like a Google or Facebook. My view is that knowledge networks will democratize the use of data, just as Ford's assembly line helped democratize the car. In the coming years, we will witness a divide between companies that choose to use their data and those who do not. The ones who fail to seize this tremendous opportunity will go the way of the horse. It's time to adapt or risk falling farther and farther behind. So to illustrate my point, I've tried to isolate characteristics of organizations destined to fail for lack of a big data strategy. They stifle information, they listen selectively, they use ineffective distribution channels to disseminate ideas. Inevitably, they fail spectacularly to their data-savvy adversaries. In contrast, what are the characteristics of those who are succeeding? More than merely measuring execution, data informs their strategy and is central to all of their business. Data is shared and accessible to those who need it when they need it. Data isn't an afterthought, it's their biggest asset. This wave of change is already in motion, but DLD is about looking ahead. What will happen when more and more companies start using data strategically and mere insights are not enough? I predict that in the future, the hard work will be the differentiation through brand building and strategic alliances, pioneered by companies like Nike and Apple. When the problem of analyzing big data is automated by technologies like ours, I also predict there will be a renaissance of sorts. Creativity and vision will be critical to success. As Ford himself once said, thinking is the hardest work there is, which is probably the reason why so few engage in it. In an era when everyone around the world can send a message to anyone around the world, distribution is a commodity. Brand and customer relationships are your only differentiators. Those who fuse what they learn from their data with inspired and creative thinking will pull ahead. Humans have the unique capacity to innovate. My view is that creativity, especially in marketing, has been pushed to the sidelines due to the challenges of managing the explosion of data. With knowledge networking, I think creativity and innovation will make a huge comeback. The purpose of this panel is to figure out how to get from here to there. So to get started, I'd like to introduce our panel's moderator, Diane Brady, who will then introduce the other panelists. Diane is an extraordinary journalist and an acclaimed author. She serves as senior editor and columnist at Bloomberg Businessweek, where she reports on corporate strategies and global business issues. She's won several national and international awards for her coverage, and she's also the author of the recently released Fraternity, which was named Best Book this month by Amazon. So without further ado, Diane Brady.
That made you go over, Heidi. Thank you. That intro tipped you over by about 30 seconds. So, thank you for making the farmland turning to freeway an inspirational image. And the only other thing I'll say is this is the only digital conference I've been to where we have dead animals looking on us. So I think that's an inspiring thing in itself. Well, I think I will introduce, beside Heidi, we have Dave Goldberg, who is are you founder and CEO or no, CEO, just simply the chief Survey Monkey. And Stefan Olander, who is Vice President Digital Sport. Hold up your wrist, Stefan. Well, he's got the special product he's going to talk about, which is collecting no end of data on us, which will be used to good effect. I want to start by, first of all, asking, well, first of all, who says data? Did you notice this morning, Buddy Media, it was all about data? Who says data and who says data? I'm a data person, but I've been corrected twice on my way to pronounce it. Heidi's laid it out. I want to hear the two of you just define it for us, first of all, because I hear so many different definitions right now of big data. I think that would be helpful to start. I'm going to start with you, Dave.
Yeah, I know. I think Heidi did a great job. I mean, I think we've had data for a long time. I think when people start talking about big data as something that we need to invest in from a business perspective, it's really about actually creating insights and analytics off all the mass quantities of data. So when I think of big data, it's actually less about the data and more about how can we take disparate, large sets of data sources, sometimes they're coming from lots of different places, and put them together and get to insights. And so analytics is as much a part of it as the data itself. And so we've had all this data for a long time, but actually we're figuring out ways to give it to people in ways they can actually use it now to make really important decisions and drive their business.
Is that your definition, Stefan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very well described. And at Nike, our whole purpose and existence is about inspiring athletes to be better and do more. And the power of information, for us, it's like it moves from data to information that then we can turn into knowledge, because we work with athletes and play that back as motivation, and that creates a really healthy cycle. So the data itself is just a raw source, whether it's, you can relate to it as electricity or oil or oxygen, but at the end of the day, it's what you do with it that's interesting, and that's where we focus.
I want to say, okay, let's say that I am, okay, Dave, I am Stefan. I have you do all sorts of surveys on my behalf as Nike. Do you own that information? Can you slice and dice it? Because I'm curious, is it a winner takes all where Facebook and Amazon and Google get the bulk of our information?
Well, I think, no, I think that the data is going to come from a lot of different sources. And I think what actually happens for Nike or a small business or a government or an educational organization is they want to control how they use their data. So for us, we're really about actually giving people the ability to collect data to make a decision and letting them control it. So they actually design the surveys themselves. We don't do it for you. You go on to our service, you create your own survey, you send it out, and then people come and respond on our site, and then we give you the analytics to analyze it. So we're pushing all the work to you, but you control that experience. I think it's sort of giving the power of data to every person, whether that's a small company or an individual in a large company. I think that's kind of one of the parts of this revolution, is that it's not going to be controlled in large data centers by the CIOs. It's got to filter down into all parts of your organization, small companies, nonprofits, et cetera. So it's not a top-down thing.
But you are now bigger than Gallup, and you've got a mountain of data, and so you're saying you can't use that, you can't leverage it, it's not a competitive advantage for you?
It's, it's a competitive advantage for us because we get 40 million responses a month, and that some of those people then come and sign up for us. So that's how people learn about SurveyMonkey. But no, it's your data. I think there is, what we have done is to sort of leverage what people are asking to get better questions. So we understand everyone's asking relatively the same question about customer satisfaction, for example. So we designed a whole series of questions that we think are the best way to ask those questions, and we created this question bank. So that's about as close to it. But anything else, we think people would be very upset about. It's your data. People are asking very personal things. We have very personal employee surveys, a lot of very confidential information, and we're very clear that's your data.
And so Heidi, you jump in, because I think being a technology player is very interesting in this space.
Well, I was going to say, I think people need to move away from the paradigm of proprietary data and saying what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. And the example I'll give is, how many of you know what dark matter is? Does anyone? So it's basically this phenomenon in the universe where we can only see 18% of the universe, and the rest of it is actually implicating how the universe functions. And no one could figure out what this was until one day NASA and some other organizations came out and said, we're going to open up all the data that's ever been done in researching this, and a month later the problem was solved. And I think companies should follow that example of saying, you know, I'm not going to hoard all this data to myself and sort of keep it to myself. There are partners I need to share it with. There are partners who can share things with me. And the goal should be getting the answers, not so much what I do with this data in the back room.
But Nike, you've got incredibly valuable data on, what, 5 million customers? Would you just hand that over and make it public domain and say, hey, tell me how to work with this?
Yeah, I mean, the Nike Plus running community is now over 5 million excuse me, runners. And what's interesting is that we don't really view it as our data. These consumers have entrusted us with their information because they believe we can play something back to them that is of value. So rather than trying to sort of capitalize or utilize that, we just sort of say, if the best thing we could possibly do using this information is inspire you to be better or get better. If you get better, you're going to reward us with your loyalty. If you reward us with your loyalty, that's going to, in the long run, generate positive results. So I think rather than obsessing over data as a gross metric, we just look at it at the individual level and say, again, you come back to us, you trust us, how do we use that and play that back to you rather than as a collecting it?
And we don't like to plug companies here, but talk
Yeah.
about this, because you just launched this
Yeah,
thing on your
yeah.
wrist here, and you're measuring your calories as we speak, right?
Yeah,
We all
it's
want
Water's
yeah.
0, by the way.
so I'll make this really
You can
short.
turn it on.
Yeah,
Turn it on, show us
it's really hard to see in this very high spotlight. But basically what this is, we launched this on Thursday in New York, and it's fascinating to see the response. It's a wrist-worn device that captures your everyday activity, and in doing so, it motivates you to do more because it's got a very simple display that moves from red to green. You start your day in red, it resets at midnight every day, and then as you go through your day, you progress through yellow, and when you hit your green, you hit your goal. It's got Bluetooth, so it talks to your phone, so you can connect with a much broader set of people. It's got USB built in, so you can charge it anywhere in your charger. But what's interesting is the behavior that it creates, where you're aware now of how you're doing because it tracks your steps. It tracks something we call Nike Fuel because we don't think it should be hard to follow, so we create a metric that you can compare and compete with anyone. And when you have those things, you don't really think of it as data. You think of this as a simple way to stay motivated, and you're aware of how you're doing every day. So what's interesting with it is it's taken data and it's taken science, but it delivers it in the simplest way
But
possible.
you will amass a huge amount of data from
Yeah.
this exercise
Yeah.
when people buy it.
Yeah.
You can give the price in euros because it's kind of expensive in dollars, but $149.
Yeah, that's
Heidi,
nothing.
I want to ask a little bit, and you know, anybody jump in here. I'm always curious about you know, the technological advantages, and I'd love you to talk a little bit more about what you're doing at Collective Eye, just in terms of, it's almost like an insurance model. There's a lot of data out there, and it's the metrics you pick, it's how you slice and dice it that adds value. And talk a little bit about that, because I think that's what is paralyzing to a lot of companies, is they have so much data, they just don't know what to do with it.
So we're in the business of creating knowledge networks, and the idea behind that is that we do all of the back-end hard work of storing the data, processing it, normalizing it, all of the stuff that's going to make you all fall asleep if I go on and on about it, so that companies can then exchange data and work with one another to develop the partnerships and get to the next level. So I'm sure it's very similar on a business scale to what you did with the wristband, where you took this enormous amount of data and now you enabled people to get knowledge from that data, but I'm sure they can also share through a network of their friends, and it becomes very motivational. So the end goal is what people can focus on instead of the data management itself. And the one thing, Diane and I talked before this panel, and in my presentation, I said that, you know, I think that creativity has largely been sucked out of marketing, and I feel like that's happened because of issues of big data. So when you hear things like chief marketing officers or data scientists, or people are turning the whole marketing function over to math majors, while I do think those skills are important, the challenge is that marketing has always been a creative function, and the large amounts of data that have been created have actually turned it into a data management function more than marketing at its core.
We've talked, you know, we talk about this as a neutral exercise, and privacy concerns keep coming up. We've seen again and again data is compromised with my credit cards, and so let's say healthcare data. Do I want my boss to know I had 11 years of alcoholism before? No, I don't want that known. But how do you protect it? I mean, so I would love to hear you, because every Survey Monkey I get, it's like, don't worry, your boss will never find out that you are in fact dissing the company.
I won't send those results over.
Thank you.
I think there's obviously a lot of concern about privacy. I think actually that there's a pretty simple standard to go by. When you're collecting personally identifiable information, the consumer or whoever's giving that information has to understand what they're giving and how it might be used. And if it's not clear to people, they're going to be upset. I mean, it's really not that hard. And I think we have tried to create laws to protect people, and unfortunately those laws, you can't keep up with where the technology is. But I think if you kind of have this simple standard of, if you're giving people personal information, that person needs to know that they're giving it, and they need to sort of be okay with it being shared and being used. And as long as you stand by those things, most people are okay with it. There's a tremendous amount of data that's out there that has nothing to do with the internet or computers. Where you live, what stuff you bought. There's tons of that data that's out there, and they know a lot about you too. We just kind of gotten used to it over time. It's more the fact that people aren't used to it, and they're not aware of how their data is being used. So, one of the things that people get freaked out about on the internet is this use of retargeting for marketing, right? So you're following somebody around because you saw they came to your site, then you're hitting them with ads as they go to other sites. People get a little creeped out by that. It's like, they know that I was there, but actually once they get used to it, you realize, you know what? Seeing ads from something that I'm interested in is better than seeing ads for, hair loss products if I'm not losing my hair, right? So
or you forget to list you're married on Facebook and everything is a dating site. It's like, no, I don't need that.
But that personalization, once we get over the kind of, wait, is this creepy? You start to go, okay, they don't actually know who I am.
But there's a difference between individual and government. We had an EU commissioner in yesterday talk. I mean, we're seeing a lot of moves, whether it's in Washington and Europe, where you're seeing regulation come down. And I don't know to what degree you think that might derail the opportunities. Do you have any views on that?
Well, I think there's a big difference between public and private use of data. So when you're talking about it in the marketing context, 99.999% of marketers I know have absolutely no interest in knowing a person's particular information. They want to find trends, they want to find ways to retarget and target a person better based on their preferences. And actually they see bad advertising as a form of torture for the end consumer, and if they can prevent that using data that they've collected, that's what they want to do. Governments, on the other hand, are a whole different story, and I think it's very interesting that governments have access to all this personal information, but all the regulation is being focused on the private sector, when really much more of the danger actually lies where they are.
But a lot of the potential is healthcare, isn't it? That's where big data could really make a difference.
It could, and that's the thing I was going to say when you mentioned, if your employer knew that you were an alcoholic, it's different than saying, I would give my information to solve a particular kind of cancer, to cure it if I could. And so I think, the purpose of the data is more of an issue than the data itself and who belongs to it.
Yeah, and I think maybe adding to it is, and the way we spend a lot of time thinking about it is, rather than amassing data to target someone and or expose someone to messaging, really the starting point needs to be, now that I know something more about you, how can I serve you better? How can I provide something that is of more value to you? And that may not necessarily be communication. Or put something, a commercial messaging in front of you, but rather look at it through the lens of, for us, obviously in the world of being active in sports, is most people have a desire to improve, whatever that might be for them. And data gives us the opportunity, again, to come back to knowledge. And if you have, for us, we work with phenomenal athletes, and we've got all this information in our labs. And now, for the first time, we have an opportunity to, we say, we've got 40 years of athlete information that we want to put in the hands of every person in the world through their phone or whatever device we provide. And that's where it becomes interesting, because you shift the conversation from a communication conversation to a connection conversation, and one where you actually serve your consumer rather than put your messaging upon them. So,
Dave, how have you found the evolution of the data that you're getting actually helping you to, ask better questions, design better surveys? Because that clearly has been an advantage for you, and there's a science to this, but is data actually helping to hone the science a lot more?
Yeah, so we get, as I mentioned, we get about 500,000 surveys created on our service a month, and so, but a lot of people who are doing that, they're not market researchers, they don't know how to ask questions appropriately, and so what we're doing is basically putting a lot of places in our product where people can learn how to do this better. And so one of those ways is looking at questions across all the different types and sort of creating the methodologically correct versions. Another thing we're doing is adding a better analytics engine on the back end to help people analyze the data when they get through it. So for example, a lot of people here might know what a confidence interval is or statistically significant, but most of our users, it's just, it's an HR person inside a big company, it's someone who runs a small business, we have schools and teachers that use us, they're not familiar with some of those concepts. And so if we can kind of bring more science to it by using what we know about how people should ask questions and how to get better quality data. At the end of the day, people are trying to gather data to make a decision. I mean, as Stefan said, that's it, that you're trying to have knowledge. And so we're just trying to use the data we have to sort of improve people's ability to make better decisions and to marry it with other data. That's sort of where we're headed as well. Is sort of, I completely agree with Heidi's point. Like, you want people to not only have their data available and accessible, but if they choose to marry it with other data sources. So that's how you really get some great insights.
And I was going to say, that's where you saw, the same thing happened in social networks where people were able to aggregate all of their information in one place. You're going to see the same thing happen in knowledge networks.
Help us see around corners a little bit, because right now we're just getting our arms around what is it, how do you use it. Take us, 3-5 years from now. What's the conversation around big data? What has Nike done with the wrist thing or anything else that really is, somewhere we haven't been before? Because we've had mountains of data for, decades. We've done some stuff with it. What can we do now, and where are some of the more innovative uses?
I don't know that. Maybe the biggest shift is there'll be less talk about data itself. That's just a given, and you put that to the side, and then you think about the benefits that come from it. And I think we've touched on them today. And I don't think that much changes. Human behavior is pretty much the same. In the world we're in, people want to be motivated. That's been the thing from the beginning. Where I think we can get smarter and use it better is to make it invisible. So you don't really have to think about input mechanism, because we've taken care of that and made that completely frictionless and seamless to use. So regardless of what you're interested in, if we can provide the power of sensors to know more about you, because
an alarm goes off when the cake goes in your mouth.
Well, that could be one way. But in general, I think we've got simple ways to, if the easier we make it for someone to do this in an effortless and frictionless way, the easier it's going to be to play it back. And I think more than anything, what's going to change is not so much that the foundational behaviors we think are the same, but what's going to change is the input and output mechanism just needs to be frictionless. And I think in general, the talk about data, it'll be like electricity. We don't talk about it, we talk about what it does for us.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I would say we did a survey that many of you filled out beforehand with DLD, and actually the thing that came back as the most popular was that was going to be the biggest topic around data was healthcare. So Diane was on that. And I think in particular, the one that will probably get people the most anxious, but also has the biggest potential, is around personalized medicine. To some degree, Nike's sort of starting that, but it's really going to be about DNA. We're going to have, everyone will be able to, go to the doctor and get their full genome sequenced for a relatively small amount of money. And so there's a tremendous amount of data. There's also a tremendous amount of concern around how that data gets used, my personal data, and what that means for me and when you share that information. And so there's people like 23andMe who are doing some really interesting work there, but I think that will subsume a lot of the other questions around privacy, all those things, because that in a lot of ways has the most implications, both positive and negative.
Oh, go ahead, Heidi.
I was going to say, I think in 3 to 5 years, you'll have your social networks, your ad networks, your knowledge networks, and data will not be the conversation. It will be, how are you being more creative to target customers that you can actually identify their preferences more succinctly?
You know, when you have these big players, and I know we don't have too much time left, but, and I mentioned, you know, Google, Amazon, Facebook, how much of this will become public domain? Because a lot of this proprietary data that you've said is, you know, the archaic putting up walls, that's considered highly valuable, and it's one of the reasons for these huge valuations. Do you think there's going to be more of a push for, you know, this information to actually be in some form public, whether you can get access to it in the first place?
I think de facto it will become almost public if it's not actually mandated to be, because it will be in so many locations that can be accessed by everyone that it'll be in effect public information.
We have just a few minutes left, so I'd like each of you to kind of, you know, give some thoughts as to even advice. This is a crowd, it's startups, it's people in marketing. When they're thinking about big data, say in the next 12 to 18 months, you can take a survey, monkey survey, but give them some advice as to how to think about it and what to look for and what you have your eyes on. Heidi, I'll start with you.
So I think step one is finding a technical solution to manage that data, and then step two is revamping your marketing department to be back what it's meant to be, which is more creative.
Yeah, and I sort of reiterate what I said in the beginning. I think it's pushing it out to all parts of your teams and your organizations. It shouldn't be something that's just in marketing or just in, it should be something that becomes part of everybody's job, is to use data to manage their job better, and as Heidi said, to make it more creative.
Stefan?
Yeah, I think, again, we've touched on it, but for us, it's obsessing with the consumer at the center. If you really, truly understand someone's needs, and desires, and you put a lot of effort into solving those, rather than figuring out, this is my message, or this is my product, or this is my service, how do I now have to get that in front of you? That's secondary. If your starting point is really, truly understanding and serving someone's needs, and using data to do so, you're always going to come out in the right place.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have. So you can harass these guys in the hall as they're walking out, but I think it's certainly good food for thought. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks.